like I said, I'll get started just a little after 12, let everybody get in and get settled, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I have 12:02 on my side, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And so welcome to today's Women Owning Woodland Virtual Lady Landowner Lunch. Today we are going to talk about forest management plans and what one is and why, particularly if we're trying to manage a large piece of property, the benefits of having one. And even for small pieces of property, these are important. So of course I should have said, so it's the start of a new month. So I think we have some new participants that haven't been with us before. So my name is Sarah Havens. I'm a field specialist in natural resources with University of Missouri Extension. I'm based out of the Phelps County Extension Office, which is in Rolla, but for Women Owning Woodlands, I actually cover the entire state. And for my kind of other like general duties, I cover everything south of Highway 50. So if you're looking for assistance, feel free to call anytime. What is Women Owning Woodland? So this is our program that we are working on continuing to develop that provides learning opportunities to women landowners and women woodland enthusiasts. We have field days, lunch and learns, and classes that we try to gear towards, again, that same group of women forest landowners and woodland enthusiasts. We also have a Facebook page. And I should add to this that there is a national network. So if you go out, you will actually find the National Women Owning Woodlands, and they do provide there's like lots of good articles and other resources. So if you're looking for even more information, that's a good site to visit. Quick update, like I do each week, some upcoming events. February 11th will be a tree sugaring workshop at Woodland, which is in Cook Station, Missouri, which is like north of Salem, south of St. James. February 12th is a Women Owning Woodland timber sale workshop that's also at Woodland. So Woodland is one of our research farms. It's a great place for programming because the university owns the property. So it's really easy for access, and it has an education center that has a nice classroom that we can utilize for classroom pieces, but then we have 800 acres of woods there, so we can use it for workshops because of having that resource right there. Then February 22nd to March 8th is the Missouri Woodland Stewards webinar series. So that'll be three sessions. So February 22nd, March 1st, and March 8th. February 22nd, Dr. Hank Stelzer will talk about carbon markets, which is kind of a new practice and a new potential for some income for forested landowners. And so he'll talk about that. March 1st, Robbie Deerhoff from NBC is going to join us to talk about the state of Missouri forest health. So she'll cover new and old threats that we have to our woods, kind of the state of the health for that. And then March 8th, a gentleman from Purdue will be joining us. He is going to talk about habitat management for some of our less for smaller species, so like salamanders and other amphibians, turtles, things that we don't typically think about our habitat management for. So a lot of times when we talk habitat management, we talk about deer, turkeys, quail, so our game species, but he's actually going to talk about habitat for some of our smaller species and ones that we don't actually use as a game species. So that should be really interesting. And that series is completely free, and it'll be 7 to 8:30 on those evenings. And then last but not least, February 26th, I will be hosting a timber sale workshop in Lebanon. So that's open, not geared towards our WOW group. It's kind of my general audience workshop. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into management plans and what it is and why you would want one. So first off, a management plan, this is a document plan. So, and I'm going to approach this from forest side, but you can have management plans that include other parts of your property that aren't forested. So if you're managing prairie, if you're managing pasture, even include sometimes your water resources. But a forest management plan is our most kind of typical plan that we have out there. And for the most part, your forester or a forester will write this management plan. In some cases, a private lands conservationist. So these are employees that work for Missouri Department of Conservation, and they have so we have two kinds of private lands conservationists right now. So some that are just PLCs, and then some that are private land foresters. And so they would write the forest management plans. So if we work with a PLC, they usually also help with the open areas, whereas a forest management plan is going to really focus on your forest resources. And so this document is one that's written typically by a forester, and it's going to provide clear information on your current forest conditions and plans on how to improve the forest conditions to meet the objectives that you as the landowner have identified. So this is kind of it's usually for a 10-year period of time, and it's a roadmap to kind of get to where you want to get with your forest management. Objectives are things like larger deer populations, more turkey. I want to have a timber sale. I want to see more oak regeneration. So that's kind of what the objectives are. And oftentimes if a landowner doesn't necessarily, perhaps they know sort of what their objectives are, but they don't know how to convey that to their forester, the foresters can also help you kind of put your objective into words. So why would you want one of these management plans? So one, it gives clear details on what you have on your property already. So how many trees, what species of trees are there, the size of the trees that are present. So this really is what you have, what they have found. So the forester that writes your plan is going to walk your entire property. They're going to walk and collect all this information. So they're going to have a lot of resources to put into your plan to let you know what they've seen, what they've identified, and what that current condition is. And then they're going to go take that information about what you have with the idea of what you want for the future. And then they're going to give you the directions on what you need to do to meet those objectives for what you have on your property. Also, from a fiscal perspective, most cost share plans that provide funding for things like timber stand improvement or prescribed fire or invasive species management, all of those are going to require a management plan. So the sooner you get one written, the sooner then those cost share programs can start to help you. The other latest thing for management plans, I'm going to bring up carbon again. So if you are planning or on trying to sell the carbon that your forest is storing, some of these carbon markets will actually require that you also have a management plan in place. And so again, just one more benefit to having these management plans written. So what are objectives? Because that's really where we start when we talk about a management plan. And that's the first thing before your forester or other consultant, natural resource consultant goes out in the woods is they're going to ask you about your objectives. And so again, some common objectives for forest property are a lot of wildlife habitat improvement. So more habitats for quail, turkey, deer, and even sometimes the small wildlife. Timber production. So how can we make our forest produce more from a financial perspective and from a forest products perspective? How can we do that? What's there? Should it be harvested? And I should say that usually when we prescribe harvest, I do have landowners that their objectives are, to make a little bit of income off their forested property through timber sales and timber production. However, generally when a forester prescribes timber sales, this is going to be used as a management tool. So particularly in Missouri, so I probably have preached this a number of times, but most of our Missouri forests were completely clear cut in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So we were cleared for things like agriculture, but also for timber that got sent back east and for development of communities and building of infrastructure. And so most of our timber in Missouri is, especially our bigger trees that we have, they are anywhere from 100 to 130 years old, which means that they are starting to mature. But we have kind of taken things like prescribed fire and some of our other like natural processes that help trees naturally thin themselves. And so a lot of our forests in Missouri are actually overstocked, meaning that we have more trees than that particular habitat can support. So in some cases, or in most cases, a timber sale is prescribed to help us open up those forests so that we don't have as many trees utilizing the resources. And this is really good because when trees are stressed and they are sharing resources and they're sharing smaller resources and are there to support them, they can have things like makes them more prone to insects, disease, and just general mortality. And so that is what we as foresters actually use timber sales for, is to as a management tool. And some other objectives of forest health. So some of you are probably aware that things like white oak mortality, the last 10 years, we've seen a little bit more white oak mortality, which is just a kind of a generic term for when our white oak trees appear to die for no reason. It's usually a culmination of things like stressors such as drought or other weather conditions, and then perhaps some insect damage or a fungus such as armillaria. So it just kind of leads to white oaks dying in an area, what seems rather sudden, but it usually is kind of the culmination of conditions. So again, and then also like emerald ash borer has really affected our ash population. So those things are forest health, so we can do some things to put those in place to improve on what we have on the property. Objectives are flexible and really are what you want for your property. I give an example all the time. I once worked with a private landowner that was a photographer, and so their objectives for their property were really to make beautiful places for their photography business. And so that was, like additions of things like wildflowers, making sure they had like open areas and open areas under the trees. So those were the objectives that we had in mind when we were prescribing things. So obviously for that particular landowner, we did not prescribe things like timber harvest in areas that also had pretty features that they wanted to take pictures of. So they can be and really should be whatever it is you desire for your property. How do you get a management plan, or where to start looking for one? So there's a couple different ways to get a management plan. So the first one, and probably the most common method, is to contact your Missouri Department of Conservation private land forester. They can help you get started, and oftentimes they can write the plan for you. This is the most common and generally the most cost efficient, because they will write the plan for free for private landowners. but it can take some time. So again, we do not have, usually a private lands forester covers anywhere from 3 to 6 counties. And so it takes them a little bit of time to get through meeting with you, inventorying the property, and then getting that plan written. So this can take some time when we go that route. If you're anxious to get started, and in some cases, even if you go to the Missouri Department of Conservation, they may send you this route, is to contact a consulting forester. So Missouri has quite a few private foresters that they will write a management plan for a fee. And so they'll give you a quote on how much it is. It's usually a price per acre for writing that management plan. But in some cases, different MDC foresters will actually have some funding so that they can actually, since they're so behind on getting management plans written, they have money they can bid out your management plan to a private consulting forester. And in that case, the Missouri Department of Conservation will pay the private forester fee so that you get your management plan. And this is a great route, because then that forester is going to write your plan to with the MDC template, and it will meet those requirements down the road if you're looking at things like cost share. Another method is to contact a natural resource conservation service forester. So these are federal foresters, and they work out of usually your local USDA office or NRCS office is where you'll find them. We do have even fewer NRCS foresters. So they are, at this time, I believe we have 4 of them that kind of split the state into quarters. And so they will, very rarely will they write the plan for you, but they also have funding for you to find a contractor to write the management plan. So, and oftentimes with them, it'll be a cost share. So you'll pay a percentage of the management plan, and then they'll pay the rest. But this is also really good if you're looking at getting into some of those federal programs, such as EQIP or WIP, or any of those other acronyms that we love to throw around, is to go through them, because then you'll have that plan for that cost share as well. And several years ago, NRCS and the Missouri Department of Conservation, they kind of joined forces, and they put together a template for management plans that work for both federal and state cost share. And so no matter which route you go, your management plan is going to actually be good for either. So hopefully that makes sense. So how this whole process goes: first, your forester is going to actually want to meet with you to discuss your objectives and learn about what you want on the property, and to get some history and information about your property. So things like when you purchased it, how, what are the past practices that have happened? Have you had timber sale before? Have you treated invasive species? Just a little bit about the property. And then this is also where they like to ask about the boundaries. So usually they can, again, through the use of technology, it's gotten fabulous over the last decade, being able to find boundaries and information online so that we can make maps. But they will also usually want to verify with the landowner, okay, do you own this corner? Do you not own this corner? Or is this where the fence really goes? Things like that. So that's good information to go over with them. The forester will then do the use of aerial photos. They will, aerial photos and topographic maps. So they'll make what we call a forest stand map. And so this is going to take, so especially large pieces of property, it's a little overwhelming. And as we probably all know, the forest is not the same in all parts of the forest. So different ridge tops have different properties than north facing slopes. We know the ridge top in the riparian area have different species composition, trees grow differently there. So they're going to use that information along with soil type, topography, aspects, and those aerial photos, and they're going to break your forested area into smaller, more manageable chunks. And that is what we call the stand map. So then using the stand map and usually a data collection system, they're going to inventory the trees and resources on your property. So this is where the forester is actually going to be walking your property, and they're going to put in, and we have certain requirements based on the size of stands. And so every stand is going to have a minimum of 3 inventory plots. And so these are plots where they collect all the tree data, and then through the use of computer calculations, that data gets put into the computer, and it kicks out information that gets extrapolated to the whole stand. So that will give us things like how many trees of each species do we have in the stand, what's the basal area, and basal area is kind of a complicated or hard to envision piece of data that foresters work with a lot. But essentially basal area is if you took, and it's square feet per acre is the measurement for basal area. So if you were to take every tree in that acre and cut it off at diameter at breast height, which is 4.5 feet, that is the amount of square feet that those cross section of tree would actually take up. So again, hard to envision, but what that information gives them is the information on how stocked is a stand. So does it have more trees than it can probably support? Does it have fewer trees and we have room for growth? It gets put out into like basal, into stocking percentages and board foot. So how many board feet for timber sale purposes or just kind of general information. And so those measurement plots are important for that. Measurement plots will also collect information on what's on the understory. So do we have good oak regeneration? So are we seeing like the next forest being established on the ground, or is it sterile? Do we have nothing? And this is important because a lot of times we look at a forest and we're like, oh, I have lots of big trees in the canopy. The understory is empty and it's beautiful and I can walk through it. And this can be very pretty to look at. But what we really are concerned about and some interest when we do these inventory plots is what's coming up. What's going to be that next forest if we open it up? Are there trees to take places of the current trees that are in the canopy? Are we growing that next forest? So that'll also be collected in these measurement plots. They'll also note things like invasive species, if they're present or not. If they come across an area in a stand where we have some dieback, that is also noted. And in addition, the inventory not only collects information on living trees, but also inventory on dead trees. So we did have a lunch and learn probably a few months ago where we talked about the importance of snags for wildlife. So they'll make note of trees that are dead, but in that snag category, so that's good for some of our wildlife. Again, after they do, so this is kind of a mix of numerical data collection. So they kind of measure trees, and we measure the height, we measure the diameter of breast height. We give a measure of the condition. We also usually one per stand using a increment bore will collect, drill a hole into the tree and pull out what we call a core, and we can see the rings and we can age the tree with this. So that gives us a lot of good information. We'll do, again, condition of the tree. So there's actually several different codes that we use for trees. So one is a desirable growing stock, meaning that this is a tree that's nice and straight and is in good health, and it's just like a perfect tree that we'd like to. They're not usually perfect, but this is a tree that has potential for good forest products, but also is in good health and is useful as a source of food for wildlife. That kind of checks all those boxes. Then we also designate trees as undesirable growing stock. So undesirable growing stock is going to be trees that are Perhaps they have really low forks. They are in poor health. They, again, just have kind of poor growing conditions. And it might be one that's an undesirable species. So things like honey locust, that's a tree that's considered an undesirable species because they don't have much value from the timber perspective, but they also don't have much value from a wildlife habitat perspective. So they can get that category. We also have some other kind of more codes that aren't used as often. So we can have desirable growing stock with a hole or a I won't be able to think of the term today, but it can be desirable growing stock, but also have like what we consider habitat holes, or it can be undesirable growing stock, but it has those habitat holes on it. We also have coal trees. So these are trees that they are living, but for whatever reason, there's no forest product in them. So from the timber side, and they have very little use in the forest. So after the fieldwork's all done, the forester brings all the data back. They get to run reports that get put in the plan. So this is going to kick out, again, trees per acre by species, basal area, board feet per acre, and it'll be all organized by stand. They also will come back and write out any observations they made in the stand. So this is going to include, again, that regeneration information. So did they see trees growing in the understory? Did they see seedlings coming up? How much sunlight was the forest floor getting? They'll also include cultural information. So this, again, if they kind of come across anything, evidence of past uses, caves usually make it into my cultural information. Any type of observation that, again, is not really collected or caught in the numerical data can get put in here. Then they'll also put in the understory information. So the way an inventory plot works is generally our larger trees, so anything like 4 inches and up, they get caught in the inventory plot, but our smaller stuff does not. And so we don't catch as much about the understory species. So we usually just write notes about that. After reviewing the data on tree sizes, the numbers and species that are present, along with their own ocular observations that they've made, they'll use that information to put together management recommendations. So we have a pretty common toolbox that we use for forest management. So this usually includes things like forest deemed improvement, or FSI, timber sale, invasive species management, or prescribed fire. So again, depending on what they're seeing on the ground, these are kind of our toolbox of what we use. Sometimes there's a few other things that come up depending on the situation, but these are really our top 4. And I can honestly say that I've come across very few stands in my history of being a forester that didn't have at least a small note about invasive species management. So it's kind of sad that I've come across very few stands that are invasive species free. So that one is extremely common. Forest stand improvement is a kind of fancy way of saying that we need to do a thinning. So sometimes if we get into a forest when it's in its younger stages, perhaps there's not enough board footage there to have a timber sale. But if we were to thin that forest, so maybe it's got a lot of small trees growing pretty close together, if we go through and do a forest stand improvement or a thinning, we can remove some of those, again, undesirable species or undesirable growing stocks, so trees that perhaps are growing crooked or have low forks. We can remove those early on and then improve growing conditions for our really good timber or our really good trees for wildlife. So that's kind of the uses of those. A timber sale is going to be something we find in a really established forest stand. And so we're gonna, again, use this kind of as a management tool to open up the understory for regeneration. And so that's where that one comes in. And then prescribed fire is one that we use for, it can help with invasive species management, but it can also help with growing conditions for like understory forbs, some of our understory shrubs, which are useful to wildlife, but they maybe aren't, perhaps we have so much leaf litter on the ground that they aren't able to establish themselves. So prescribed fire can help with that. It can also help kind of just improve growing conditions for the next generation of trees. So then all of that data, stand descriptions that they've written up, they'll also pull all the soils information and the prescriptions and cultural data. All of that gets put into one document. So you'll get, usually it's anywhere from like 30 to 60 pages of document, and that is going to be your management plan. So that document will be presented to you. And if you've perhaps had a private forester that's done it, they'll present it to you and your perhaps MDC forester or your NRCS forester at the same time. And they will review the information with you. And this is a great chance. And I kind of do these talks about management plans because I know, like, particularly, getting all that information presented to you at one time, they usually ask, do you have any questions right now? And sometimes it's a little overwhelming, like I need to digest this document before I have questions. But this is also the chance. So when they're presenting the plan to you, they do try to pull out the highlights, anything that was of like particular importance or interest, or what has more urgency than other things. And that is I skipped. And then again, this is your chance to ask questions, but sometimes it's a little overwhelming. So it's good to digest the plan a little, and then also, meet again or talk again to your forester and ask those questions that you have. Or sometimes I also like for landowners to take that management plan out with them, kind of walk through their forest, read those stand descriptions as they go through the stands, and then this can also lead to kind of a better understanding of the plan, but also questions. So you have a plan, now what? So this is, as foresters, and I won't name names, but I know some foresters that, when they write you a plan, or if they are getting ready to agree to write you a plan, they want to know that you're going to actually use it. Because we do have some landowners that get the plans and it kind of goes on a shelf and nothing happens. So it's good. You want to try and work through the plan. I know in some cases, particularly large properties, this can be a lot. So there can be a lot of information and a lot of recommendations. And so that's where the stands come in, because we can take off small pieces of our plan and make small accomplishments along the way. It would be very overwhelming if we're like, you need to do this on all 100 acres or 300 acres or 1,000 acres, depending how much you have. So in your plan, there will be a schedule of prescriptions or recommendations. And this is usually your forester has kind of identified the most important pieces or most urgent. So if we have, back in the early 2000s, we had a lot of red oak borer that came through. And so if we could salvage that wood before it all died from red oak borer, that might have been top of the list to do a timber harvest on that. So this is a good place to start. There's also some annual recommendations for all properties. So things like maintaining your boundaries, monitoring your forest health, and monitoring and controlling invasive species. So even in stands that perhaps don't have a lot of invasive species, it's good to keep track of it from year to year. So I, for example, wrote a management plan in 2015 for someone, went back to do a timber sale for them in 2018. And just in 3 years, several of their stands went from like 1 or 2 honey locust plants to complete understories of not honey locust, honeysuckle. And so it's good to keep track of those invasive species. And sometimes we might need to control them sooner rather than later. It's good to review your management plan at your 5-year mark to talk about your progress and evaluate where you're at. And then every 10 years, the plan should be updated. And, you know, unfortunately, trees and other plant species continue to grow, and wildlife habitat continues to evolve, and wildlife we have on our property seems, you know, also changes. So it's good for, that's why we recommend every 10 years you update that plan. Plus, you have made progress. So if you've done TSI, if you've done timber harvest, if you've done invasive species control, re-inventorying and reassessing is going to provide you information on the effectiveness of your practices and of your tree growth. So, and I should go back because I did have, this is usually what the activity schedule looks like. And so it tells you which stands, the acres. There's a practice code. They also usually spell out what treatment is going to be. And then, like I said, these templates work for NRCS cost share or federal cost share. So there's usually that NRCS resource concern. And then here's where they're going to put treatment details. So for example, if it's a forest stand improvement, it'll say we want to remove 25 to 35 feet of basal area per acre. So that's when you talk to a contractor who's going to help you with your TSI, or if you're doing your TSI yourself, you know the metrics for which you're trying to reach and what you're trying to remove. And then they will also give you a planned date. This isn't usually like a specific day. It's usually a month and a year. And then there's this will be empty. That completed date will be empty, and then that's a place for you to check it off when it got done. So that's what that schedule looks like. And really our bottom line for forest management and plans and goal is for healthier forests and better wildlife habitat. So that's kind of our bottom line. That's why we work hard to promote forest management. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna look and see if there's any questions. This is a topic that I tend to talk passionately about because I worked a long time in the field, actually working and writing management plans. Yes, Laura, you're right. When you have a lot of stands, it's hard to ask them questions, but getting that idea of what stands should take priority for action definitely helps. And I know that certain, they'll give you kind of like what is most important. And some of these practices, with timber harvest in particular, we can actually kind of lump some stands together and to kind of get all those pieces all at one place, but it helps a great deal to see what they have as priority. And again, my educational director in particular tells me all the time, what's the best way to eat an elephant, one bite at a time. And that's really what those stands are with helping for your management practices. Is there any market for the smaller timber that is taken during forest improvement where thinning is needed? There's not a very reliable market for that. So if you're kind of in the right place, there are some kind of niche industries that'll take that smaller timber out of like the Eminence area. There's a mushroom producer that is always like happy to take oak logs that come out of forest stand improvement. It doesn't pay great. I do a workshop called Management Mushrooms, and we talk about, if you do a forest stand improvement, perhaps you can do a little bit of mushroom cultivation on your own. And then when you have large trees that come down due to weather, where can we find a market for those damaged trees? So this has been a difficult process for some of our, especially as we've seen a few more weather events that have caused like a larger like wind throw in a larger area, like the derecho that came across, and we lost a lot of trees. So talking to a logger, in some cases, they can come and do salvage cuts, is what we call it. That's the best place. It's not very easy for a typical landowner, but some do manage to kind of cut out logs and haul them themselves to a sawmill, but really it's the best bet is to try and find loggers who are interested in doing some of that salvage cutting. Are foresters only looking at timber value? No, certainly not. Depending on, so forestry really did start with a timber market production, but we do, again, keep objectives in mind. A lot of bashing of locust trees in forestry presentations. Yes, so locusts, especially black locusts, they can provide blooms for pollinators, and they are legumes, so they do make nitrogen. Also, they do use those seeds for food. So we have a lot of deer that will eat those seed pods. Unfortunately, they compete with some of our other species that also provide really good benefits for wildlife. And because of the thorns, particularly on honey locust, they can be just kind of a hindrance to landowners as far as tires and on vehicles and tractors and other vehicles that they use for some of their forest work. So there is also, you'll be probably happy to know there's some research that's going on with honey locust being utilized for silvopasture. Oh, great question, Laura, about a forester that has some idea about carbon credit markets. So this is a kind of a new horizon for us in forestry, a new endeavor. So we have a couple private foresters that have some idea about carbon credit markets. It is kind of really good to know what so most of our carbon, so we have kind of carbon buyers, and then we have carbon like credit agencies. And so these carbon buyers, if you will, they oftentimes have their own foresters that will kind of go through the process of assessing your property for how much carbon it is storing. And I will tell you that the best first step is to educate yourself on the different buyers. I literally sat through a presentation this week that had 3 different carbon buying companies talk, and each of them kind of had a different contract system, a different buying system, and different requirements for their contracts. And so it's good to research that. Like I said, we have that program, and Hank is going to talk about kind of the same thing, giving that broad overview. But there are more and more consulting foresters that are getting educated on how these carbon markets are going to work as we go forward. So still very new in Missouri. What is a carbon credit agency? Are they the companies that say and pay extra for your airplane ticket? So they, not as much for our airplane tickets as it is, so they are kind of carbon brokers. So larger companies, Fortune 400 and 500 companies will they have an idea of how much carbon they are releasing from their company, and then they will, and we have 2, I just learned this actually this week, that we have voluntary program, and then we have like required. So they've been told you have to figure out a way to offset your carbon. It's under the regulatory. And so, but they know how much carbon that they're releasing into the atmosphere. And so they know how much they need to buy or pay for elsewhere in storage. And so they are going to pay us, and it's measured in tons. So they will contact these brokerage agencies, and they are going to quote unquote buy carbon storage. And so that broker has that money coming in from them, and then they are going to look at, so if I wanted to sell my carbon storage, they're able to look at the number and size and species of trees that I have on my property and calculate how much carbon I am storing or capable of storing on my property. And then they're gonna pay me to leave it as is so that it will continue to store that carbon. Does that make sense? So your raw land with trees and tons of leaves, it could be. So you could leave it and collect a check based off that. Buying and selling carbon storage from already existing forest sounds like a shell game. So oftentimes it is buying that carbon to prevent it from being harvested or removed or converted. So they're trying to provide an income so that it will remain forested and as a carbon sink. So it's a little bit of a shell game, but it really is also aimed at maintaining that forested area as a carbon storage facility. So any timber management, so often, yes. So that, and again, depends on the company you're working with. So some have longer term contracts that your timber management can be included as part of your contract. And then some do not want you to have any timber harvest done on the property. So I love walnut and shagbarks, and I'm okay with the rest of the cedars and white oaks. Yeah. So again, I cannot legally give advice on carbon markets and what to do and what not to do. We can just give you the information about what's out there as far as possibilities. And if you're really interested, like I said, sign up for Hank's carbon market overview, or like go out there. There's a lot of additional information presentations that are going on right now from the carbon industry as to the differences between those companies and how it all works. I put out there to landowners to do research before signing any contract. Yes, let me get you the link to sign up for this. So, and it is, you'll sign up for the series, but again, you don't have to attend all of the series. You can come to just the one that's the carbon overview. It is free, and we will record it. So again, if you can't make the time that we have it scheduled for, we'll record it like I do. Record it like I do, and we'll share it with those that have registered. So there's the link to that. Yes, no problem. So yeah, and right now we do not have as many companies working in Missouri. So again, there's a company that kind of originated out of the Southeast, and they're kind of slowly working their way to Missouri. And then there's another company that is kind of a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation. And they started with this kind of work in Pennsylvania. And then there have been some carbon markets that have been in existence for about the last decade. So 10 years ago, we really kind of saw the first of these carbon markets come about, but just in the recent couple years, as we've learned more about climate change, and there's a little bit more urgency because of climate change to figure out this system. We've seen an explosion of growth in this market. So Missouri, we're still kind of on the corners, but I have more and more landowners that have either been contacted by carbon buyers or are in the process of touching base with carbon buyers. So we're getting there, but we definitely want landowners to be as educated as possible before. So Nature Conservancy is one of them, and they're doing it through the American Family Forestry Group. The other one is NCX, and that one's out of the Southeast. Any other questions today? There's lots of work in the carbon area, and hopefully it is my hope to put together a program on our carbon markets that gives lots of information. But again, we're kind of still learning it as we go. And so hopefully you get ahead of this thing. I'm actually on a grant that's out of Pennsylvania that's looking at kind of the carbon market, climate change, and how it affects our family foresters. Oh, thanks, Laura, for that article. Anything else today? So next week will also be on Friday at noon. And next week we are going to talk about preparing pollinator beds for spring. So things we can be working on to get ready, either to freshen up existing pollinator beds or for working on establishing pollinator habitat, things we can do this time of year to get prepped and ready for that. So I hope everyone has a great weekend. We got about 7 inches of snow where I'm at. We have some debris in our forest. Anything in plan about that? So oftentimes that is something that a prescribed fire can help break down, is some of that debris a little bit faster, because especially if there's a large layer of that detritus, that will prohibit like acorn growth and tree growth.
Man-made debris, is it more like metal and trash debris perhaps that we're looking to get rid of? So that is sometimes in the plan, but we don't, I haven't seen any cost share to help get rid of that, but I'll look with my sources and see if there's any for it. But they would sometimes maybe put that in the management plan, particularly if it's, unfortunately, not just in Missouri, but other states, but Missouri has a lot of sinkholes, and those are places that before we knew better, we used as areas to dump trash on our property. So in some cases, if it's noted that there's a sinkhole that has debris in it, they'll put that in the plan to get rid of it. So, but I will check with my other sources about cost share for that, because I haven't seen any, but I will definitely ask for sure. All right, I think that is it. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week.